Got anger issues, PTSD, but I try to toe the line. Honest work for honest pay, but men leave lives of crime. They stole my boss's daughter, yeah, and I'm running out of time. I guess I'm no longer a working man. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases in an attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. So, as per usual, before I get into the review proper for this week, I'd just like to stop and give a special shout out to some other movies I thought looked fun or interesting, which includes several art house releases, chief among them being Holy Cow, a French coming-of-age film that marks the feature debut for writer-director Louise Courvoisier, co-writing with Theo Abadi. We have another writer-director debut for Dutch filmmaker Leonardo van Dijk, co-written with Ruth Beckart. This is a psychological drama called Julie Keeps Quiet that profiles an elite student tennis player as her team's coach becomes under investigation and is suspended from his position. Very topical, woman-centered sports material there that, fingers crossed, could be a really great opportunity for any upstart feminist and queer critics out there to say, hey, while everybody is complaining about trans girls in female sports, this is the actual sort of stuff we should be focusing on when it comes to, actual threats to girls and women in sports. But what do I know? I could never ball, but I can sure as hell spitball. There's also a really exciting and erotic-seeming queer romantic drama coming out of Vietnam, of all places, titled Viet and Nam. That'll be a sophomore effort for writer-director Minh Quy Trong, following his 2019 debut, The Treehouse. Portuguese director Miguel Gomez also enters the fray this year. He's probably best known stateside for his 3-volume epic Arabian Nights that came out all the way back in 2015. His latest film is called Grand Tour. This is a period production shot in what looks to be some absolutely immaculate black and white cinematography. It follows a panicked man who flees from and is subsequently pursued by his fiancée in a journey spanning Southeast Asia. And on a lighter, more accessible note, we also have The Penguin Lessons starring Steve Coogan, and I don't really tend to go for those kinds of quirky, exacerbated, and befuddled English comedy dramas, but come on, it's Steve Coogan and an adorable penguin, what can I say? But this was also seemingly a pretty good week for the B movies, and honestly, my biggest regret is that I'm only coming back this week with a solo picture review and not a proper exploitation double feature. The cards didn't necessarily get dealt well enough for me to take that challenge on, though I do eventually want to get to a place where I can do some more double feature reviews again. So just quickly rattling off my top picks for B and exploitation pictures from this past weekend. The supernatural horror film The Woman in the Yard, that looked surprisingly intense, and I really kind of loved the premise ever since I first saw the previews for it ahead of Snow White, of all things, 2 weeks ago. Then we got Black Heat, one of those very low to the ground, frankly looking like a modern direct-to-VOD blaxploitation film courtesy of writer-director Wes Miller. And then just so we got horror, we got urban blaxploitation. What else do we need? We need a last stand shoot 'em up action flick, and it looks like Day of Reckoning has us covered on that front. Doesn't look terribly original, but I'm actually surprised because at least visually I really am turned on by the aesthetic it seems to be going for, with all this softer focused and muted but still warm lighting. Plus it's got Billy Zane with a big bushy beard, and I'm already a ride or dyer for Billy Zane, but Billy Zane with a big bushy beard, now you're cooking with gas. But I didn't see the B horror this weekend. I didn't see the new blaxploitation flick. I didn't see the Last Stand shoot 'em up. I saw A Working Man, the latest vigilante action star vehicle for modern-day action icon Jason Statham, here being directed once again by none other than the still severely underrated David Ayer, hot off the surprising dark horse success of The Beekeeper from last year. A Working Man is fairly paint-by-numbers vigilante action material at a basic basic plot level. You know, grizzled old Jason Statham. He's a former British Special Forces soldier who, all the while having struggled with his PTSD and the suicide of his wife, is just trying to live a normal life as the foreman on a construction site, you know, while trying to get full custody over his little daughter. He's really trying, you know, to put his life and violence and trauma behind him and make it as just a working man, you know, just a regular working bloke. But I'm also not just a working man, you see. This is a family-owned construction company, and my boss, Michael Pena, he and his authentic multi-generational Latino-American family. He's like my brother, and they're like my family. So when my boss, my brother's 20-something academic and music and sports prodigy daughter, who, despite being an academic and music and sports prodigy, all she wants to do is get a practical business degree so she could take over the family business. When that man's daughter gets abducted by sex traffickers in cahoots with the Russian mob, it's really not going to take much persuasion for this working man to take off the tool belt and belt some Russians. Know what I mean? And look, in addition to being a ride or dyer for Billy Zane and a big bushy beard, I'm also a ride or dyer for David Ayer. With rare exception, I think he's honestly had one of the most robust and exciting, and at rare instances, even awe-inspiring careers in 21st century crime and action films, which of course goes all the way back to his days as a screenwriter when he practically blew the doors off with Training Day, directed by Antoine Fuqua in 2001, but really in earnest as a director cranked things to another level with his official debut, Harsh Times, 4 years later, that one starring Christian Bale in a magnificent central performance. For me, Harsh Times is really a slept-upon seminal movie and really definitive for David Ayer as a director and writer, because whereas lots of action filmmakers in the late 90s and early aughts were chasing after a more urban-centric gangsta tone, Ayer, coming from his own background as a Midwestern high school dropout who came of age in South Central Los Angeles, did what a lot of directionless hood rat kids do, ended up enlisting in the U.S. Armed Forces, and then made his play as a filmmaker. Ayer was uniquely posed to claim for himself and define that new tone in American action, not just penning Training Day, but also working on the screenplay for Fast and the Furious. In the same generation that birthed Eminem, David Ayer is kind of like the definitive wigger director, and with Training Day and then Harsh Times, and then with his not as impressive but still quite entertaining directorial follow-up, Street Kings, only to strike real gold yet again with the found footage crime thriller End of Watch, another severely underrated and under-remarked upon new modern classic in his oeuvre. No writer-director working in action and crime cinema, especially for a white guy, I think, has had such a definitive stamp upon his work in terms of accessing the heightened mythology that has grown out of a period in U.S. history where, while violent crime, and specifically gang crime itself, has precipitously fallen since its heights in Ayer's youth and informing so much of his early work, it still stands so tall in the public imagination at a time where income inequality is expanding and in the poorest and most crime-ridden of urban centers, while white artists like Ayer and Eminem as his musical counterpoint before him certainly have a privilege of a pathway out that most of their Latino and Black and Asian contemporaries do not get, still had access to a feeling and a moment where it seemed like all those socioeconomic and cultural factors were blurring the lines between who can authentically rep where poor and desperate people are at, where the mentality is at as far as how people learn to grind and survive in a get money, everybody else sort of mentality. Ayer might be a white boy, but like with Eminem in his music, in Ayer's films, it is very easy to see the difference between filmmakers who are merely wearing the urban aesthetic as a costume or an exploitation patina, and someone who really feels it in their blood because they are from that. And even if, as his star rose as a director, as he had to work even more closely within the studio system that severely hamstrung him on projects like Sabotage and Suicide Squad, even as he has attempted to branch out into more kind of vulgarly poetic projects like Fury, which I still think is among the best films of 2014 and certainly one of the best war films of the 21st century. That Wigger stamp that he carries with him is still there, culminating in Bright, which, while certainly no masterpiece, is easily entertaining as just the most Wiggerish American urban fantasy movie that's ever been made. And I'm saying that even knowing that Vin Diesel's The Last Witch Hunter exists. And in the aftermath of the disappointments of both Sabotage and Suicide Squad, first with The Tax Collector in 2020, we have seen Ayer gradually working back to a form where he not only re-embraces his roots as a filmmaker, but even finally with The Beekeeper, that fall even harder on his identity as a rise and grind auteur of B action schlock. And while I certainly felt myself left behind in a lot of the love The Beekeeper received, it must be said that it still was a refreshingly earnest bit of B action schlock that, elevated by Statham giving one of the most bizarre but also one of the best performances of his career, also seemed to see Ayer working towards a more darkly comic tone that, again, unique among his contemporaries, didn't ever seem to announce its awareness of itself, was a ridiculous and at times quite funny B action flick, but one where you tread what I find to be an endlessly compelling line between, okay, is this ridiculous and funny due to a lack of self-awareness? Or are the filmmakers so self-aware of what they are doing that someone like Ayer doesn't even feel the need to do what his contemporaries do in ever announcing in that sort of, well, that just happened way of, yes, this is supposed to be a ridiculous bit of dark comedy. You don't take it seriously. You embrace how all these pot-boiled or really boiled over vigilante action cliches are pinned down to their most obvious, ham-fisted, prosaically retarded elements and aesthetics, and push that just far enough that you get the joy of watching a movie that is entertaining as an action comedy, but never feels the need to spell out to us as an audience that the filmmakers know exactly what they are doing with it. And in that sense, I have to say, I found A Working Man to be a far more polished, a far more technically impressive, if not amazing in terms of Ayer's previous action work, a far more elementally entertaining piece of B action schlock than The Beekeeper, which I think, working from a script by Kurt Wimmer, suffered too much from its own globe-spanning, world-building ambitions, whereas A Working Man, in that the vigilante template here is so much more contained and grounded in terms of scale, that it becomes easier to appreciate all the ironically more refreshing twists that Ayer makes on the formula. And with a much firmer confirmation of that idea that we can all just relax, it couldn't be more obvious, Ayer knows exactly what he's doing. This is not supposed to be Training Day. This is supposed to be Commando. This is ridiculous B action schlock for the sake of it, and which wears its absurdity as almost a badge of honor. This project actually started out as a Sylvester Stallone production. It's an adaptation of the Chuck Dixon pulp novel Levin's Trade that Stallone originally wanted to do as a TV series, that is, before it got stuck in development hell and Ayer came on board to whittle it down to a single feature. And once you realize that this was originally supposed to be a TV show, it makes so much more sense why A Working Man, despite its relatively simple plot, is structured in the rather anarchic or circuitous way that it is, where Statham, as our vigilante hero, is always finding himself getting so close to crucial people and information to rescue his brother from another mother's daughter. You can definitely see how this film works as almost like an abridged series of episodes in a limited TV series, belonging, in template at least, more to the vigilante crime and hero shows of the 70s, so that what honestly makes A Working Man the most entertaining from a design perspective is how it almost becomes a montage in various types of settings where everything is so over stylized, from the typical urban club to the Irish pub to the outlaw country biker bar to the upper fueled boutique hipster costume ball. None of these aesthetics are new to action cinema, especially in the hyper aestheticized world building shadow of the John Wick franchise. But again, there is just something about the tone that Ayer is able to bring to this project where, even on a much smaller budget scale, there are times at which you almost feel like, even if the action clearly isn't as well choreographed or directed, unfortunately, Ayer's work in that department is much better than it was in The Beekeeper, but not much better. On this B schlock scale, all of these little bits and baubles of themed design frippery almost come off as somehow more impressive. And I think it actually speaks the most highly to Ayer's very unique trademark as an action and crime auteur, that even if the action is clearly not as good as it could be most of the time, he still has, as a director, such a talent for identifying interesting and compelling design choices that, even at this smaller scale, almost seems to exceed the budget of the production in terms of its comic book absurdity. There's definitely a lot of classic Walter Hill influence going on in both The Beekeeper and A Working Man, now that I think of it. And it's not just in the set dressing. There are so many different kinds of guys in this movie that are ridiculous in their own unique ways, that are almost like begging you to doubt that the filmmakers know what they are doing, only for you to settle into a scene like where Statham is calling an old army buddy who now works with the narcotics enforcement, who, as he's on the phone with him, cutting back and forth, this guy's black, he's this big, jacked black guy, and the actor who's playing this guy is still saying all the dialogue in Ayer's script that is written in this urban affectation, but he, as an actor, is just saying them with the most handled, controlled, enunciated way that it becomes like a flashback to all those classically trained actors like Ron O'Neal and Superfly, who are speaking jive, but like as if they're Othello or something. Ayer is a director who, like a lot of action directors, clearly takes pleasure in the simple, vulgar, guttural act of looking on something dynamic or expressive or extravagant. Except what he likes to look at is not just the action. He really likes to see worlds come alive. And he doesn't really care if it comes alive in ways that triggers a sense in the back of our heads that, you know, this might be even a little too absurd, a little too reaching, but complemented by one of the most ham-fisted, didactic vigilante action scripts that has ever been written, I think. Again, it reinforces the idea that Ayer is thoroughly in on the joke, or at least just the joy of firing off a script where the dialogue prose, knowing he can do much better, is literally like having almost every character just spell out exposition and motivation in the most terse and direct way, and where pretty much every actor just plays it completely straight, where the line between the roots of this movie in Commando and The Warriors and other Walter Hill films of the like, but then also A Naked Gun, the line is very, very thin there. Like, I swear to God, Statham on the other line in this phone call, he's literally dressed like Eminem in 8 Mile. Like, I'm not exaggerating. Again, it's like Ayer at this point in his career is almost parodying his own trademark as a wigger filmmaker, where the counterpoint between this British guy living in this hovel apartment and dressed like he's going to be in a cipher after he clocks out of his night warehouse job, and on the other end is this ripped black guy who we are so used to speaking in a certain way in movies. He's doing the blaxploitation dialogue, but without any ethnic patina to it. It's just, he just reads them straightforwardly, like as if Barack Obama was saying them. That's the thing, because while Ayer might not be terribly unique in that he's an action director who doesn't mind, but in fact quite enjoys making dumb, quickie movies with zero subtlety, being the reformed wigger that he is, he's still kind of a weirdo. He still is kind of attracted to so many small choices that other even bargain bin action directors wouldn't even acknowledge because they know it would be going too far. And which at times points to a black comic subtlety that clashes completely with our sense of how unsubtle this movie is in virtually every other sense. Like, Ayer is honestly proving himself to be, again, such an underrated master of both doing really dumb shit, honestly, mostly really dumb shit, but then also doing stuff that you can only divine comes from some sort of artisan sense of humor that, like a true artist, you know must make absolutely zero sense to anybody who isn't him. And not just stuff like a very obvious and clearly comical sting on the soundtrack when one of the main villains says his name, and so the music responds with like a bum, like, oh, this is the guy I've been looking for this whole time. Even though we already know who it is way before he does, so it just accentuates how absurd it is that they're introducing this guy and he just says his name and then the soundtrack goes, boom. But it'll be other things like in the climactic action sequence where we cut directly from Statham all kitted out about to storm the compound to this blink and you miss it close-up shot of a painting of a screaming woman, and there's this jump scare sting on the soundtrack, and then Statham is just in the compound. He enters the shot, and it was just like, what the hell was that for? It'll even be in something like, and I think this is the second most entertaining thing I got out of A Working Man. Look, we're used to action movies where a lone vigilante shooter or brawler martial artist goes through bad guys like a knife through paper. But with A Working Man, it's on another level where part of the not so much understated, but just not overstated comedy of the movie is that so many of the guys that Statham ends up fighting are just clearly not up to the task. Like, they aren't just elite criminals being owned by an even more elite hero. Nobody in this film ever seems to send their best guys to do anything because they don't even seem to have good guys to send. So many of the villains and bosses are so incompetent and unprepared in their own unique ways that, without giving away too much about the great action climax to this schlock, part of the joke seems to be that Statham is even fighting down the rung, that as he gets closer to his goal, the obstacles he has to overcome just get easier. The people he has to go through just get even more hilariously outmatched and out of their element. And speaking of that action climax, I do also have to put in a special note for what would otherwise be a totally thankless role as the rescued girl. The young Ariana Ribas not only puts in a really good performance, coming from a writer-director who really doesn't have that good a track record with women characters in his movies, and especially Latinas in his movies. I gotta say, some real thought and love was put into giving Ribas a role she could really sink her teeth into, and where not just that, but honestly part of the point of A Working Man even seems to become that parallel to the schlocky Statham stuff, where everything is boilerplate, everything is spelled out so explicitly. Ribas's character goes through her own arc that is so much more nuanced and so much more dramatically compelling that, again, it kind of ends up enhancing so much of the comedy of the movie because you're just watching this really serious young Mary Sue just alone among this rogues gallery of some of the dumbest sickos ever to walk the earth. But it's still all building towards, again, an opportunity for Ayer to really subvert our expectations and do something ironically relatively refreshing and exciting, even in this boilerplate action schlock. So yeah, A Working Man, not a new action masterpiece by any stretch of the imagination, but even in my biased position as a Ayer ride or dyer, I'm prepared to say that I was reasonably entertained and even at times quite impressed by it, if not exactly by the action itself, then by everything else around it. I'm going to give this one a 3 out of 5. With that, I'm going to head out. Thank you so much for sitting through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right, what did I get wrong? Otherwise, please like, share, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.